The evening air in Manhattan carried that peculiar October chill, crisp enough to warrant a coat, but mild enough that the city's energy remained undiminished. Yellow cabs weaved through Columbus Avenue while well-dressed New Yorkers hurried along sidewalks toward their Saturday night destinations. Among the brownstones and boutique storefronts, one establishment stood out with understated elegance. Lombardi's Crown, a family-owned Italian restaurant that had served the city's elite for 3 generations. Daniel Hayes stood near the host station, adjusting his black tie with practiced precision. At 38, he'd perfected the art of invisible excellence, the kind of service where guests felt attended to without ever noticing the attendant. His dark hair, graying slightly at the temples, was impeccably groomed. His posture remained straight but not rigid, his expression pleasant but not intrusive. After 15 years in high-end hospitality, Daniel had become a master of reading rooms, anticipating needs, and navigating the unspoken hierarchies that existed in spaces where entrees cost more than most people's weekly groceries. "Table 12 needs water," called Marcus, the junior server, rushing past with a tray of appetizers balanced on his shoulder. Daniel nodded, already moving toward the service station. His movements were economical, efficient. No wasted steps, no unnecessary flourishes. He filled a crystal pitcher with filtered water and ice, placed it on a small tray alongside fresh glasses, and made his way through the dining room. Lombardi's Crown occupied what had once been a townhouse, and the owners had preserved its intimate, residential feel. The main dining room featured exposed brick walls adorned with vintage photographs of old New York, dark wood floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot, and tables positioned to allow privacy without isolation. Candles flickered in amber glass holders, casting warm shadows that softened faces and forgave imperfections. Classical Italian music played softly through hidden speakers. "Puccini tonight," Daniel noted. He'd just finished serving table 12 when he noticed the shift. It was subtle at first, a change in the room's energy, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air pressure drops and animals grow quiet. Conversation didn't stop, but it lowered. The host, Antonio, straightened his spine and smoothed his vest with nervous hands. Even Chef Lombardi emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, his usually jovial face suddenly serious. Daniel followed the collective gaze toward the entrance. She entered like winter arriving in autumn, inevitable, transforming, impossible to ignore. Avery Romano was not what Daniel expected, though he couldn't have articulated what he'd expected. The whispered name had circulated through certain circles in the city for years, always spoken with a mixture of fear and respect. But the woman who stepped into Lombardi's Crown looked like she could have been heading to a gallery opening or an upscale business dinner. She appeared to be in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a sleek, low bun that emphasized the sharp intelligence of her features. Her suit was impeccably tailored, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes, paired with a burgundy silk blouse and heels that added 3 inches to her frame. Diamond studs caught the candlelight at her ears. Her makeup was minimal but precise. She wore no wedding ring, but a silver watch adorned her left wrist. Expensive, Daniel noted, but not ostentatious. What struck Daniel most were her eyes. Dark, calculating, missing nothing. They swept across the dining room with the kind of assessment that suggested she was cataloging exits, evaluating threats, measuring vulnerabilities. This was someone who had learned to see the world as a chessboard. 3 men accompanied her, all wearing well-cut suits that didn't quite hide their athletic builds. They positioned themselves with military precision, one near the door, 2 flanking Avery, as Antonio rushed forward with excessive deference. "Miss Romano, what an honor. Your table is ready, of course. Right this way, please." Avery didn't smile, merely inclined her head slightly. Her heels clicked against the hardwood as she followed Antonio toward the private dining section, a small alcove separated from the main room by a decorative partition, offering both visibility and seclusion. Daniel watched the procession with professional interest. In the kitchen, he heard the sudden acceleration of activity, Chef Lombardi barking orders, sous chefs scrambling to ensure perfection. At the bar, the sommelier nervously reviewed the wine list, anticipating expensive requests. Even the other diners seemed affected, their conversations now carrying an undercurrent of awareness, of performance, as if they'd suddenly become extras in someone else's scene. "Daniel!" Antonio appeared at his elbow, voice low and urgent. "You're taking the Romano party." Daniel's eyebrows rose slightly. "Me? I thought Carlo handled the private section on Saturdays." Carlo called in sick. Antonio's hand gripped Daniel's forearm, his fingers tight enough to convey desperation. "Listen to me very carefully. Perfect service, invisible service. Anticipate everything. Make no mistakes. Do you understand?" "Of course," Daniel replied evenly, though Antonio's intensity sparked curiosity. Same as always. No. Antonio shook his head. His round face sheened with perspiration despite the restaurant's comfortable temperature. Not the same. This is… Daniel. Just be perfect. Please. Before Daniel could respond, Antonio hurried away, leaving him to approach the private section with his usual tray of water glasses and menus. The two men who'd accompanied Avery stood like sentries on either side of the alcove entrance. As Daniel approached, one of them, a man in his early 30s with a scar above his left eyebrow, stepped forward, blocking his path. "I'm the server for this section," Daniel explained calmly, keeping his voice professional. "I have menus and water service." The man looked him up and down, then glanced toward Avery. She made an almost imperceptible gesture, and he stepped aside. Daniel entered the private dining space, immediately assessing the setup. The round table could seat 6 comfortably, but had been set for 4. Avery sat facing the entrance. Of course she did, with the third man positioned to her right, leaving 2 empty seats. The table was dressed with Lombardi's finest linens, the silverware polished to a mirror shine, the wine glasses arranged in proper order for a multi-course meal. "Good evening," Daniel began, his voice warm but not overfamiliar. "My name is Daniel, and I'll be taking care of you this evening. May I start you with still or sparkling water?" "Still," Avery replied without looking up from her phone. Her voice was lower than he'd anticipated, with the kind of control that suggested she rarely needed to raise it. "Room temperature." Daniel noted the specification with approval. Someone who understood that ice-cold water numbed the palate. He poured carefully, aware of the scrutiny from the man to her right, whose dark eyes tracked every movement. "Would you like to hear our specials this evening, or would you prefer a moment to review the menu?" "We'll have a moment." Avery set down her phone, finally looking directly at him. The impact of her full attention was considerable. Those dark eyes focused with laser precision, and Daniel had the uncanny sensation of being thoroughly evaluated in the span of 2 seconds. He'd been examined by wealthy clients before, assessed by celebrities and business moguls, but this felt different. This felt like being appraised for threat level, for usefulness, for a dozen criteria he couldn't begin to guess. Of course. "I'll return shortly." Daniel placed the menus with quiet precision and withdrew. Over the next 45 minutes, Daniel executed what he considered textbook service. He gave them appropriate time before taking their order. Avery chose the branzino, prepared tableside, while her companion ordered the osso buco. He recommended a wine pairing, which Avery accepted with a slight nod. He coordinated with the kitchen to ensure perfect timing between courses. He maintained the delicate balance of being available without hovering, attentive without intruding. The private section allowed him to observe more than he normally would. Avery and her companion, who she called Marco, conducted their dinner like a business meeting. They spoke in low tones about shipments, schedules, territory agreements. Daniel carefully didn't listen to specifics, focusing instead on the rhythm of service, the dance of courses. Avery ate with purpose rather than pleasure, Daniel noticed. She consumed food like fuel, efficient and methodical, but she also ordered well, choosing dishes that showcased the restaurant's strengths, asking informed questions about preparation methods. This was someone who understood quality, even if she didn't seem to particularly enjoy it. It was during the main course that Daniel noticed the problem. He was clearing the appetizer plates when his eye caught on something that made him pause internally, though his hands continued their smooth, practiced motions. Avery had positioned her wine glass incorrectly, too far from her water glass, interfering with the proper placement for her bread plate. More significantly, she was holding her fish fork with her full fist, like a tool rather than an instrument, using it to cut rather than to separate the delicate flesh of the branzino. Daniel felt the familiar tug of professional pride warring with practical wisdom. He'd spent 5 years studying at the Culinary Institute, another 3 working in Michelin-starred restaurants in Europe, learning the intricate ballet of fine dining service. Proper etiquette wasn't about snobbery. It was about maximizing the enjoyment of carefully prepared food, about respect for culinary craftsmanship, about the elegance of tradition refined over centuries. But he also possessed enough social intelligence to recognize that correcting Avery Romano's table manners ranked somewhere between inadvisable and suicidal on the wisdom scale. He cleared the plates in silence and retreated to the service station, trying to dismiss the observation. It wasn't his business. She was paying customer. If she wanted to eat branzino with her hands, that was her prerogative. Yet the thought nagged at him as he prepared for the next course. Daniel had always prided himself on doing things correctly. Not out of rigidity, but out of genuine belief that there were better and worse ways to approach most tasks. Teaching proper technique to junior servers had become one of his quiet pleasures. The idea of letting an error pass, even a harmless one, felt like a small betrayal of his professional standards. "You're thinking too hard," said Maria, the senior waitress, as she passed him at the service station. I can see smoke coming from your ears. Daniel smiled slightly. Occupational hazard. Everything okay with the Romano table? Maria's voice dropped to a whisper. You look concerned. Daniel hesitated. Have you ever noticed when someone is doing something wrong, something small that doesn't really matter, but you know the correct way and it bothers you not to share it? Maria's eyes widened. Please tell me you're not thinking of correcting her. It's just table etiquette, basic fork usage. If this were any other client, but it's not any other client. Maria gripped his wrist, her grandmother's hands surprisingly strong. Daniel, I've worked here 23 years. I've served mayors, celebrities, people who could buy this building with pocket change. But when she comes in, even Chef Lombardi gets nervous. Do you understand? Just serve the food, smile politely, and pray she tips well. Daniel nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in her words. Yet as he returned to the private section with the cheese course, a selection of Italian varieties paired with honey and fig compote, he found himself still wrestling with the dilemma: professional integrity versus personal safety, excellence versus expedience, the principle of doing things right versus the practical reality of knowing when to stay silent. Avery was speaking into her phone when he arrived, her tone clipped and authoritative. I don't care about his excuses. The deadline was Thursday. It's now Saturday. Handle it. She ended the call without saying goodbye, immediately turning her attention to Marco, continuing a conversation about quarterly projections. Daniel presented the cheese course, explaining each variety, noting which knives to use for soft versus hard cheeses. As he spoke, he watched Avery select a piece of aged pecorino and reach for the wrong knife, the one designed for soft cheese, which would crumble the harder variety. He opened his mouth to explain the difference, then caught Maria's earlier warning echoing in his mind. He closed his mouth, but his hand, operating on 15 years of training, instinctively moved to indicate the correct knife. Avery noticed. Her eyes flicked from his hand to the knives, then up to his face. One eyebrow arched slightly, a question. In that moment, Daniel made a choice. Not out of bravery, not out of foolishness, but out of something fundamental to who he was. He'd built a career on doing things correctly, on respecting the craft, on believing that details mattered. Compromising that felt like compromising himself. Forgive me, he said quietly, his voice respectful but clear. The knife to your left, with the pointed tip, is designed for harder cheeses like the pecorino. It allows you to apply pressure without crumbling. The rounded knife is for soft varieties like the taleggio. Silence descended over the alcove like a heavy curtain. Marco's hand froze halfway to his wine glass. From somewhere in the restaurant, Daniel heard a dish clatter in the kitchen. Even the background music seemed to fade. Avery stared at him with an expression he couldn't read. Surprise, certainly, but something else beneath it. Her hand remained hovering over the cheese board, neither retreating nor advancing. Additionally, Daniel continued, committed now to his course, if I may, the fish fork for the branzino earlier is designed to be held more delicately, between the thumb and first two fingers. It allows you to separate the flesh along its natural flakes without crushing. The technique preserves the texture that Chef Lombardi worked so hard to achieve. The silence stretched. Daniel's heart rate accelerated slightly, but his exterior remained calm, professional. He'd chosen his path. Whatever came next, he'd face it with dignity. Marco started to rise from his seat, his face darkening, but Avery raised one hand, a small gesture that froze him mid-motion. Her eyes never left Daniel's face. You're correcting me, she said slowly, as if testing the words. Not a question, an observation. I'm offering guidance on proper European dining etiquette, Daniel replied evenly. The same guidance I would offer any guest who might benefit from it. Chef Lombardi's food deserves to be experienced optimally. That's all I'm trying to facilitate. That's all. Avery's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but something close to it. Or perhaps a grimace. You're aware of who I am? I know your name, Miss Romano. Beyond that, you're a guest in this restaurant, someone who ordered excellent dishes and should have the opportunity to enjoy them as they were intended. Avery leaned back in her chair, studying him with that penetrating gaze. Seconds passed. Daniel could feel Marco's hostile stare, could sense the tension radiating from the security detail beyond the partition. The entire restaurant had gone quiet, as if collectively holding its breath. Finally, Avery picked up the pointed knife, the correct one. She cut a piece of pecorino with precise pressure, placed it on her plate, then looked up at Daniel again. Show me, she said simply. Daniel blinked, momentarily thrown. I'm sorry? The fork technique. Show me the correct way. For a moment, he wondered if this was a test, a trap, some elaborate setup for humiliation, but her expression seemed genuinely curious, even if her tone remained controlled and cool. Daniel gestured to the fork placement. "May I?" At her nod, he adjusted the position of her silverware slightly, demonstrating the proper hold with his own hands in the air, a mime of the technique without touching her utensils after she'd used them. "The key is balance," he explained, falling into the rhythm of instruction that came naturally after years of training junior staff. "The fork should feel like an extension of your hand, not a tool you're wielding. Light pressure, letting the tines do the work. Fish, especially delicate preparations like branzino, will fall apart naturally along the proper lines if you're patient with it." Avery watched intently, and Daniel had the strange impression that she was memorizing every word, cataloging every detail. When he finished, she nodded once. "Thank you, Daniel." She emphasized his name slightly as if committing it to memory. "That will be all for now." "Of course. Please let me know if you need anything else." He withdrew from the private section with measured steps, neither hurrying nor dawdling. Only when he reached the service station did he allow himself a moment to process what had just happened. Maria appeared instantly at his side, her face pale. "Are you insane? Do you have a death wish?" "I was doing my job," Daniel replied, though his hands trembled slightly as he reached for a water pitcher to refill. "Your job is to serve food, not to give etiquette lessons to—" Maria cut herself off, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "Daniel, people don't correct her. People don't even make eye contact unless she addresses them first. Then perhaps someone should have, earlier in her life." Daniel surprised himself with the edge in his voice. "She's a person, Maria. She ordered good food. She deserves to know how to appreciate it properly. That's not about fear or respect or any of the rest of it. It's just basic hospitality." Maria shook her head, looking at him with something between admiration and pity. "You're either the bravest man I've ever met or the most foolish. I genuinely can't tell which." The rest of the service passed in a blur of hyper-awareness. Daniel delivered the dessert course, panna cotta with mixed berry coulis, and noticed that Avery now held her spoon correctly with the refined technique he'd suggested. She caught his eye as he poured coffee, and something flickered in her expression. Amusement? Respect? Before her face returned to its carefully neutral mask. When she finally requested the check, Daniel presented it in the leather portfolio, placing it equidistant between Avery and Marco out of professional habit, though he suspected Avery would handle payment. She did, sliding a black credit card into the folder without looking at the total. "Thank you, Daniel," she said as he retrieved it, "for the excellent service." "It was my pleasure, Miss Romano." As he processed the payment at the server station, Antonio materialized beside him, practically vibrating with nervous energy. "What happened in there?" "Marco looked ready to throw you through a window, but she seemed, I don't know, not angry?" "I provided service," Daniel said simply. "Same as I would for any guest." The receipt printed, and Daniel placed it in the portfolio along with her card. He returned to the private section one final time, setting the folder before Avery with a slight nod. She opened it, glanced at the receipt, then withdrew several bills from her wallet, cash, which surprised him. She placed them in the folder and closed it, her hand resting on the leather surface for a moment. "Daniel," she said, her voice quiet enough that Marco had to lean in to hear. "A question." "Yes, Miss Romano?" "Why did you correct me?" "Truthfully." Daniel considered his answer carefully. The honest truth felt dangerous, but he'd committed to authenticity when he'd first opened his mouth about the cheese knife. Retreating into platitudes now seemed cowardly. "Because you chose excellent dishes," he said finally. "Because Chef Lombardi puts his soul into this food. Because proper technique enhances the experience, and you seemed like someone who would appreciate excellence when it's offered. And because—" He paused, then committed fully, "because treating someone differently due to who they are rather than who they could be feels like a disservice to both of you." Avery's expression shifted, something vulnerable flickering beneath the controlled surface before disappearing. She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Thank you for your honesty. That's rare." She stood, Marco rising instantly with her. The security detail outside the alcove straightened to attention. Daniel stepped back to allow them passage, watching as Avery moved through the restaurant with that same commanding presence she'd arrived with. At the entrance, she paused, turning back. Her eyes found Daniel's across the dining room, holding his gaze for 3 seconds that felt much longer. Then she was gone, the door closing behind her, the October night swallowing her and her entourage. The restaurant remained silent for another beat, before conversation gradually resumed, the tension slowly draining from the room like water from a tub. Daniel returned to the private section to clear the table and retrieve the payment folder. Inside, he found 5 $100 bills, a tip that exceeded the cost of the meal itself. But more significantly, beneath the cash, he found a business card. It was simple, expensive cardstock with raised lettering, just a name, Avery Romano, and a phone number. Nothing else. No title, no company, no email address. Daniel turned the card over in his fingers, studying it in the candlelight. A dozen questions formed in his mind, but no answers presented themselves. "What did you get?" Maria asked, appearing to help clear the table. Daniel pocketed the card quickly. "A generous tip. That's it? That's it." But as he continued his shift, serving other tables with his usual professional attention, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had shifted. He'd crossed some invisible line, violated some unspoken rule, and instead of punishment, he'd received, what? Curiosity? Interest? The rest of the evening passed normally. Tables turned, dishes were served, checks were paid. By 11:30, the last guests had departed, and the staff began their closing duties. Daniel wiped down tables, refilled salt and pepper shakers, helped the bussers stack chairs. The familiar routine was comforting, grounding him back in the normal world after the strangeness of the Romano table. He was folding linens when Antonio approached, his earlier nervousness replaced by something like cautious relief. "So," the host said carefully, "she didn't seem upset when she left." "No," Daniel, "she didn't. But you corrected her table manners." "I heard about it from 3 different servers. I offered guidance on proper technique. There's a difference." Antonio laughed, shaking his head. "Only you, Daniel. Only you would see a difference worth dying for. I'm not dead." "No," which is honestly surprising. Antonio squeezed his shoulder. "But maybe don't tempt fate twice, eh? Next time she comes in, Carlo can take the private section." Daniel nodded, though he wondered if there would be a next time, and if so, whether she'd request a different server or even a different restaurant. Perhaps he'd offended her more than she'd let on. Perhaps the generous tip was a farewell, a way of acknowledging his audacity while making it clear she wouldn't return. He finished his closing duties, changed out of his server's uniform into jeans and a sweater, and collected his jacket from the staff room. The October night had grown colder, his breath visible in small clouds as he walked toward the subway station. His apartment in Brooklyn was 45 minutes away by train, a modest one-bedroom in a pre-war building that had character if not luxury. Daniel had lived there for 7 years, long enough that the grocer on the corner knew his name, that the super saved his packages when he worked late. He rode the half-empty subway car, surrounded by the usual Saturday night mix of late workers, young people heading home from dates and parties, a tired mother with a sleeping child against her shoulder. Normal people, living normal lives, probably not wondering whether they'd made a fatal error by correcting someone's fish fork technique. By the time Daniel reached his apartment, it was nearly 1 a.m. He unlocked the 3 deadbolts, a necessity in New York, and entered the familiar space. The apartment was small but tidy. A living area with a well-worn couch and too many cookbooks, a kitchen barely large enough to turn around in, a bedroom that fit a queen bed, and a dresser with inches to spare. He hung his jacket, kicked off his shoes, and moved to the kitchen out of habit. Even after a long shift in a restaurant, he found cooking at home meditative. He put water on to boil, retrieving pasta and ingredients for a simple aglio e olio: garlic, olive oil, red pepper flakes, parsley, comfort food, the kind his mother used to make. As the water heated, he pulled out Avery Romano's business card again, studying it in the harsh fluorescent light of his kitchen. Just a name and a number. No indication of why she'd given it to him, what she might want, whether it was a reward or a warning or something else entirely. Daniel had never been married, had dated occasionally but never seriously, had devoted most of his adult life to perfecting his craft rather than building relationships. He understood food, understood service, understood the delicate social dynamics of high-end hospitality. But this, whatever this was, existed outside his experience. He thought about throwing the card away, forgetting the entire evening, returning to his regular routine, avoiding whatever complications might come from acknowledging the gesture. Instead, he placed it on his refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like a chef's hat, a gift from a colleague years ago. The pasta water reached a boil. Daniel cooked mechanically, his mind elsewhere, replaying the evening's events. The way Avery had looked at him when he'd corrected her, the silence that had followed, the unexpected request to demonstrate proper technique, the intensity of her attention, as if she were memorizing him, and that final glance across the restaurant before she'd left. What had that meant? He ate his pasta standing at the counter, barely tasting it, then cleaned up and prepared for bed. His routine was established, comforting: brush teeth, set alarm, lay out clothes for tomorrow's shift. But when he finally lay down, sleep proved elusive. The rain that had threatened all evening finally arrived, drops pattering against his window in irregular rhythm. Daniel stared at the ceiling, watching shadows from passing headlights slide across the plaster, and tried to make sense of the night. He'd done what he'd always done, provided excellent service, shared his professional knowledge, treated a guest with respect and honesty. The fact that this particular guest apparently commanded fear and deference from everyone around her shouldn't change the fundamental equation, except it did change things. He knew it did. The card on his refrigerator proved it. Around 3 a.m, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. Daniel reached for it instinctively, expecting a wrong number or a notification from some app. Instead, he found a message from an unknown number. The text was simple, direct, containing no greeting or signature. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., address to follow, come alone, A.R. Daniel's heart rate spiked, adrenaline flooding his system despite the late hour. He sat up in bed, staring at the message in the darkness, the screen's glow illuminating his face. Questions cascaded through his mind. How did she have his number? What did she want? Was this a summons, a threat, an invitation? Should he go? Should he ignore it? Should he call the police and tell them what exactly? That he'd corrected someone's table manners and now they wanted to meet him? He read the message again and again. Come alone. Those 2 words carried implications that Daniel tried not to examine too closely. In movies, in books, those words preceded something dramatic, usually something dangerous. But this was real life, his real life, and he was just a waiter who'd offered some advice about cheese knives, wasn't he? Daniel lay back down, phone still in hand, and watched the rain streak down his window. Outside, New York continued its endless motion, cars splashing through puddles, lights burning in other apartments where other people faced their own mysteries and decisions. He should sleep. He had another shift tomorrow. Today, technically. He needed to be sharp, professional, ready to serve lunch and dinner crowds with his usual excellence. Instead, he stared at the message, at those 3 letters that signed it, A.R., and wondered if he'd just made the most dangerous mistake of his life, or if something else entirely was beginning. The rain continued. The city breathed its nightly rhythm. And Daniel Hayes, 38-year-old waiter, lay awake in his Brooklyn apartment, holding a phone that connected him to a woman who existed in a world he'd only glimpsed from a careful distance. Tomorrow at 2 p.m., that distance would disappear, if he chose to go. The question was, would he? As exhaustion finally began to claim him, Daniel's last coherent thought was of Avery Romano's eyes across the restaurant. Dark, intelligent, hiding something he couldn't name. And beneath his apprehension, beneath his uncertainty, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Genuine curiosity about what came next. Daniel woke to the sound of his alarm at 9:30, having slept barely 4 hours. The gray morning light filtered through his bedroom curtains, and for a brief, disoriented moment, he thought the previous night had been a dream. Then he saw his phone on the nightstand, the screen dark but heavy with implication. He reached for it, unlocking the screen with a swipe. The message was still there, as real as it had been at 3 a.m. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., address to follow. Come alone. A.R. Daniel sat up slowly, running his hand through his hair. His reflection in the dresser mirror showed a man who looked older than 38. Tired eyes, tension around his mouth, the kind of expression that came from contemplating impossible choices. He had approximately 4.5 hours to decide what to do. The rational part of his brain, the part that had kept him safe and employed for 15 years in the unpredictable hospitality industry, insisted he should ignore the message, delete it, block the number, pretend last night had never happened, perhaps call in sick to work for a few days, let things settle, hope that his moment of professional pride would be forgotten in the endless churn of the city's daily dramas. But there was another part of him, quieter but persistent, that was curious. Avery Romano had given him her personal number, had sent a message in the middle of the night, had requested a meeting. Why? What could she possibly want from a waiter who'd corrected her fork technique? Daniel stood, his knees cracking softly, and moved to the bathroom. His morning routine was automatic. Shower, shave, the familiar rituals that grounded him in normalcy. As hot water sluiced over his shoulders, he tried to think through the situation logically. Option 1, ignore the message. This was the safe choice, the sensible choice, but it felt cowardly, and Daniel had never been comfortable with cowardice. Moreover, ignoring Avery Romano might carry its own risks. She'd gone to the effort of obtaining his number. No small feat, suggesting resources and reach he couldn't begin to estimate. Would someone with that capability simply accept being ignored? Option 2, respond and decline. Polite, professional, maintaining his dignity while avoiding whatever complications a meeting might bring. But the message hadn't been phrased as a request. Come alone wasn't an invitation, it was an instruction. Option 3, go to the meeting, face whatever came next with the same integrity he'd shown at the restaurant. This option terrified him, but it also felt honest. He'd made a choice last night when he'd corrected her table manners. Following through seemed like the only way to honor that choice. Daniel dressed in dark jeans and a button-down shirt, nicer than casual but not formal. He didn't know where he might be going or what the day would bring, and choosing the right outfit for an unknown situation felt absurdly important. In his kitchen, he made coffee with careful precision, measuring grounds, setting the water temperature, timing the brew. The familiar motions calmed him. Whatever else changed, coffee remained coffee. Some certainties persisted. He was halfway through his first cup when his phone buzzed again. Another message from the same unknown number, this time containing only an address. 447 Greenwich Street, Tribeca, penthouse. Daniel set down his coffee cup and opened his laptop, pulling up a map. The address corresponded to a luxury residential building in one of Manhattan's most expensive neighborhoods. The kind of place where apartments sold for 8 figures, where doormen wore better suits than most executives, where privacy was the ultimate luxury. Of course she lived there. Where else would someone like Avery Romano live? He checked the time. 10:47 a.m. 3 hours and 13 minutes until the appointed meeting. Daniel spent the next hour trying to occupy himself with mundane tasks. He washed dishes, tidied his already tidy apartment, flipped through a cookbook without absorbing any of it. His mind kept circling back to the same question. What did she want? At noon, he gave up pretending he could focus on anything else. He pulled on his jacket, a charcoal wool blazer that had cost 2 weeks' salary but fit perfectly, and checked his reflection one final time. He looked presentable, professional, like someone who belonged in expensive buildings even if he couldn't afford to live in them. Before leaving, Daniel did something that felt both dramatic and necessary. He wrote a brief note on his laptop, saved it to his desktop, and emailed it to his older sister in Boston. The message was simple. If you don't hear from me by 6 p.m. today, I was supposed to meet someone at 447 Greenwich Street penthouse at 2 p.m. Her name is Avery Romano. Call the police. It felt paranoid. It also felt prudent. The subway ride into Manhattan gave him too much time to think. Daniel sat in a half-empty car, watching the familiar stations pass, DeKalb Avenue, J Street, Borough Hall, while his mind spun through scenarios. Maybe she wanted to compliment Chef Lombardi and needed Daniel to facilitate an introduction. Maybe she wanted to hire him for a private event. Maybe she wanted to ensure his discretion about something he'd overheard at dinner. Or maybe something else entirely. Something his limited imagination couldn't conceive. He emerged from the subway at Franklin Street, into a Tribeca afternoon that had turned unexpectedly beautiful. The morning's gray had burned off, leaving crisp October sunshine that painted the cobblestone streets in warm tones. Around him, the neighborhood hummed with understated wealth, boutique galleries, high-end restaurants, people walking designer dogs and carrying shopping bags from stores Daniel had never entered. Greenwich Street stretched before him, lined with converted warehouses that now housed multi-million-dollar lofts. Daniel walked slowly, aware that each step brought him closer to a decision point. He could still turn around, could still text an excuse, claim illness, disappear back into his normal life. Instead, he kept walking. Number 447 was a sleek glass and steel tower that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The building's facade was modern minimalist, with floor-to-ceiling windows that revealed nothing of the lives lived behind them. A discreet bronze plaque near the entrance bore only the address. No building name, no advertising. The kind of place that didn't need to announce itself. Daniel paused at the entrance, checking his reflection in the glass doors. He looked calm, composed. Inside, his heart hammered against his ribs. He pushed through the doors into a lobby that redefined the concept of understated elegance. The space was all marble and indirect lighting, with modern art on the walls that Daniel suspected was original rather than reproduction. A massive arrangement of white orchids dominated a central table. The air smelled faintly of expensive cologne and fresh flowers. Behind a gleaming desk sat a doorman, or perhaps concierge, who looked up at Daniel's approach with the kind of polite assessment that could determine whether you belonged or should be redirected to the service entrance. "Good afternoon," the man said, his voice professionally neutral. "May I help you?" "I have an appointment," Daniel replied, keeping his voice steady. 2 o'clock, penthouse. The concierge consulted his computer screen, his expression unchanging. "Your name, sir?" "Daniel Hayes." A few keystrokes, then a slight nod. "Of course, Mr. Hayes. You're expected. The penthouse elevator is to your right. You'll need this access card for the top floor." He produced a sleek black card and slid it across the marble desk. Daniel accepted it, noting the weight of it, the quality. Everything in this building spoke of money so old and deep it didn't need to show off. Thank you. The elevator doors were nearly invisible until they slid open at his approach. More polished steel, more indirect lighting, an interior that could have been transported from a luxury spacecraft. Daniel stepped inside, inserted the access card into a discreet slot, and pressed the button marked PH. The doors closed with a whisper. The elevator ascended so smoothly that Daniel felt the motion more in his inner ear than through any physical sensation. Floor numbers illuminated and disappeared. 5, 10, 15, 20. The building had 23 floors, he noted. The penthouse occupied the entire top level. As he rose through the building, Daniel tried to calm his breathing, to center himself in the professional composure that had served him well for 15 years. He was good at reading people, at adapting to situations, at maintaining grace under pressure. These skills would serve him now, whatever came next. The elevator slowed, stopped. The doors opened. Daniel stepped out into a private foyer that was larger than his entire apartment. The space was decorated with the same minimalist aesthetic as the lobby. Clean lines, neutral colors, carefully chosen art pieces that drew the eye without demanding attention. A single door stood before him, heavy wood with a modern steel handle. Before he could knock, the door opened. The man who stood there was not one of the security personnel from the restaurant. This was someone new, early 40s, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of posture that suggested former military service. He wore a dark suit and an expression of careful neutrality. "Mr. Hayes," he said. It wasn't a question. "Please come in." Daniel entered a space that redefined his understanding of residential luxury. The penthouse was vast, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Lower Manhattan, the Hudson River, and beyond. The afternoon sun poured through the glass, illuminating an interior that balanced modern design with classical touches, contemporary furniture alongside what looked like genuine Renaissance paintings, sleek technology integrated seamlessly with traditional craftsmanship. "Miss Romano will be with you shortly," the man said. "Please have a seat. May I offer you something to drink? Water, coffee, wine?" "Water would be fine, thank you." The man nodded and disappeared through an archway, leaving Daniel alone in what he assumed was a living area, though it was larger than most restaurants' dining rooms. He chose a leather chair positioned to face the windows, rather than with his back to the entrance. A small strategic choice that felt important, even if it meant nothing. From this vantage point, he could see the city spread out below like a model. The Freedom Tower gleamed in the distance. The Hudson flowed sluggishly toward the harbor. Somewhere down there, millions of people were conducting their normal lives, completely unaware that Daniel Hayes, waiter, was sitting in a penthouse waiting to meet with someone whose world he barely understood. The man returned with a crystal glass of water, still room temperature, exactly as Avery had ordered at the restaurant. Daniel wondered if this was intentional, a demonstration of attention to detail, or simply coincidence. "Miss Romano will be just a few more minutes. Please make yourself comfortable." Then he was alone again, with only the city for company. Daniel sipped his water and tried not to think about the email sitting in his sister's inbox, the countdown ticking toward 6 o'clock, the police call that might or might not be necessary. He studied the room instead, noting details, the books on a distant shelf, spines in Italian and English, the fresh flowers in a vase, white roses this time, the complete absence of personal photographs or obvious mementos. This was a beautiful space, but it felt more like a hotel suite than a home. Lived in, certainly, but not warmly so. Daniel wondered if that was intentional, keeping everything impersonal, maintaining distance even in her private residence. "Thank you for coming." Daniel stood immediately, turning toward the voice. Avery Romano entered from what he assumed was a hallway leading to the private areas of the penthouse. She was dressed differently than she had been at the restaurant. Dark jeans, a cream cashmere sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders rather than pulled back. She looked younger this way, more approachable, though her eyes retained that same sharp intelligence. "Miss Romano," Daniel said, inclining his head slightly. "Please, sit." She gestured to the chair he'd vacated. "And it's Avery. I think we can dispense with formality, given the circumstances." She settled onto the sofa across from him, curling her legs beneath her in a gesture that seemed unconsciously graceful. For a moment, she simply looked at him, that assessing gaze he remembered from the restaurant. "You came," she said finally. "I wasn't certain you would. Your message didn't leave much room for interpretation." A slight smile touched her lips. "No, I suppose it didn't, but you could have ignored it. Many people would have. I'm not many people. No." Her smile widened fractionally. "You're the man who corrected my table manners in a restaurant full of people who wouldn't dare breathe too loudly in my presence. Which brings me to my question. Why?" Daniel considered his answer carefully. He'd had hours to prepare for this conversation, but now that it was happening, all his rehearsed explanations felt inadequate. "Professional integrity," he said finally. "You chose excellent food. It deserved to be experienced properly. That's the same answer you gave last night. I'm asking for the real reason. That is the real reason." Avery leaned back, studying him with an intensity that made Daniel feel simultaneously exposed and valued. "You weren't afraid?" "I was terrified." His honesty seemed to surprise her. "Yet you spoke anyway." "Yes. Why?" Daniel set down his water glass, meeting her gaze directly. "Because I've spent 15 years becoming excellent at what I do. I've studied in Europe, worked in Michelin-starred restaurants, trained under chefs who treat cuisine like religion. I know table etiquette the way a musician knows scales. Fundamentally, instinctively. When I see someone using the wrong fork or holding a knife incorrectly, it's like watching someone play a beautiful piano badly. I can't not notice. And when the situation allows, when I think the person might genuinely benefit from the information, I share it. That's my job. That's who I am. Even when sharing that information might be dangerous, I didn't think about the danger until after I'd already spoken. By then, it seemed cowardly to backtrack. Avery laughed, a genuine sound that transformed her face, softening the controlled mask she typically wore. Cowardly. That's an interesting word choice. It's the truth. The truth. She stood moving to the windows, her silhouette backlit by the afternoon sun. "Do you know how rarely people tell me the truth, Daniel?" He noticed she'd used his first name, creating an intimacy that matched the informal setting. "I can imagine." "Can you?" She turned to face him, and something in her expression had shifted, a vulnerability showing through the careful control. "Everyone around me is either afraid of me or wants something from me. Usually both. They tell me what they think I want to hear. They measure every word. They perform rather than interact. It's been like that since I was 24 years old. 4 years of carefully managed conversations, strategic relationships, people who see me as a position rather than a person." Daniel remained silent, sensing she needed to speak more than he needed to respond. "And then you," Avery continued, "a waiter in an Italian restaurant, correct my fish fork technique. Not because you want anything from me, not because you're trying to prove something or make a point, simply because you know the right way to do something and you believe I should know it too. I didn't mean to offend you. You didn't offend me." She moved back to the sofa, settling in the same casual position as before. "You shocked me, which is considerably more difficult to do. When was the last time someone treated you like a student rather than a threat?" "I suppose it has been a while." "More than a while. Years." Avery picked up her own water glass from the side table, considering it thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about it since last night, trying to understand what it was about that moment that affected me so much. And I realized you saw me. Not Avery Romano, not the position I hold, not the reputation or the fear or any of the rest of it. You saw someone who was eating fish incorrectly and might appreciate knowing the proper technique." Daniel nodded slowly, beginning to understand where this conversation might be heading. "I have a business meeting in 2 weeks, Avery said, her tone shifting to something more businesslike. "International associates. Very formal setting. The kind of event where details matter, where perception is reality, where holding your fork incorrectly could be interpreted as weakness or lack of refinement." "I see. I need to know proper etiquette, not just adequate, perfect. European formal dining protocols, conversation techniques, the subtle social signals that distinguish old money from new. I need to walk into that room and command respect. Not just through position, but through flawless presentation." She set down her water glass and looked directly at Daniel. "I want you to teach me." The request hung in the air between them, more complex than it appeared on the surface. Daniel processed the implications. Regular contact with Avery Romano, entrance into her world, proximity to whatever business she conducted. The email he'd sent his sister suddenly seemed prescient. "You want etiquette lessons," he said carefully. "I want what you offered last night. Expertise, honesty, the kind of instruction that comes from genuine knowledge rather than fear of displeasing me. I'll pay you, of course. Name your rate. It's not about money." "No?" Avery's eyebrow arched. "What is it about?" Daniel stood, moving to the windows, needing space to think. Below, the city continued its endless motion. Cars navigating streets, people pursuing their goals. The vast machinery of New York grinding forward. His life down there had been predictable, safe, manageable. This, whatever this was, represented a divergence from that path. "I don't know anything about your business," he said, still facing the window. "And I don't want to. I'm a waiter and a hospitality professional. That's my expertise, my world. If I agree to this, it would be purely about teaching etiquette. Nothing else. That's all I'm asking. Is it? He turned to face her. Because people in your position don't typically need etiquette lessons from waiters. You have access to resources I can't even imagine. So why me? Avery met his gaze steadily. Because you're the first person in 4 years who's spoken to me like I'm human. Because you corrected me out of professional pride rather than personal agenda. Because I watched you at the restaurant, Daniel. The way you moved, the way you anticipated needs, the precision of your service. You're excellent at what you do, and I need that excellence. And after the business meeting, after you've learned what you need to know, then we part ways, if that's what you prefer. No strings, no obligations. You'll have been well compensated for your time, and I'll have the skills I need. It sounded simple, straightforward. A business transaction between two professionals. Daniel knew it wouldn't be that simple, but he also knew, standing in that penthouse with afternoon light streaming through the windows, and Avery Romano watching him with those dark, intelligent eyes, that he was going to say yes. Not because of money, not because of curiosity about her world, but because she'd asked him honestly. Because beneath the controlled exterior and the fearsome reputation, he'd glimpsed someone lonely and isolated. Someone who'd responded to a moment of genuine interaction with something close to hunger. One condition, he said. Name it. Complete honesty during our sessions. No performance, no careful management. If I'm going to teach you properly, I need you to be a genuine student, not someone playing a role. Avery considered this, then nodded slowly. I can do that. And I need to know, am I in danger? By agreeing to this, am I putting myself at risk? She didn't answer immediately, and Daniel appreciated that she took the question seriously rather than dismissing it with false reassurance. The world I exist in, she said finally, carries inherent risks. People around me face those risks simply by proximity. I won't lie to you and say there's no danger, but I will promise that I'll do everything in my power to ensure your safety. You'll be under my protection, for whatever that's worth. And if I want to walk away, if at any point this becomes too much, then you walk away. No consequences, no retaliation. You have my word. Daniel studied her face, looking for deception, for hidden agendas. He saw only sincerity, and something else. Hope, maybe. Or perhaps just the exhaustion of someone who'd been performing for too long and desperately needed a moment of authenticity. Okay, he said quietly. I'll teach you. Avery's smile was genuine, reaching her eyes in a way that transformed her entire expression. Thank you. When do you want to start? Is now too soon? Daniel glanced at his watch. 2:47 p.m. He had no obligations until his evening shift tomorrow. Now is fine. Good. Avery stood, her demeanor shifting subtly from vulnerable to businesslike. We'll start with basics and build from there. I learn quickly. I noticed that last night. The way you adjusted your grip on the fork after I showed you, that was impressive retention. I pay attention to things that matter. She moved toward the archway she'd entered from earlier. Come. I have a formal dining room we can use for practical instruction. Daniel followed her through the penthouse, noting more details as they moved. The quality of the hardwood floors, the art on the walls, a Caravaggio that looked disturbingly real, modern sculptures that suggested significant investment. This wasn't just wealth, it was generational, cultivated, the kind that understood value beyond mere cost. The dining room could have seated 20 comfortably. The table was already set with what Daniel recognized as genuine Cristoflo silverware, Baccarat crystal, Limoges china. Someone, possibly the gray-haired man who'd let him in, had anticipated this lesson and prepared accordingly. Impressive setup, Daniel said, running his finger along the table's edge. This is professional-grade equipment. I was told it's what's used in European fine dining. Is it correct? It's perfect. He moved around the table, assessing the placement. Whoever set this has training. My house manager, former butler for a British diplomat. He knows the theory but wanted me to learn from someone with practical restaurant experience. Daniel nodded, understanding the distinction. Theory and practice were different animals, especially in hospitality. For the next 2 hours, they worked. Daniel started with foundations, proper posture, hand positioning, the subtle art of conversation timing during formal meals. Avery proved to be everything she'd claimed. Attentive, intelligent, absorbing information quickly, and applying it immediately. But more than her aptitude, Daniel noticed her focus. When she was learning, she shed the careful control, allowing herself to make mistakes, to ask questions, to be genuinely uncertain. It was, he realized, probably the only time she allowed herself such vulnerability. The key to bread service, he explained, demonstrating with a roll from the basket, is never to cut it. You break it with your hands, one small piece at a time. Then butter only that piece, never the entire roll at once. Why? Avery asked, attempting the technique. Partially tradition, partially practical. It keeps the bread fresh, prevents the butter from melting into areas you haven't eaten yet. But mostly, it's about pace. Formal dining is orchestrated. Everything has timing. Breaking bread piece by piece enforces a natural rhythm. She practiced, her movements becoming more fluid. Like music. Exactly like music. They moved through wine service, soup technique, the proper way to excuse oneself from the table. Daniel found himself relaxing into the familiar role of instructor, the dynamic he understood better than almost anything else. At one point, Avery laughed at her own mistake, reaching for the wrong glass, and the sound filled the formal dining room with unexpected warmth. I haven't laughed like this in weeks, she admitted. Not much humor in your business meetings? Not much humanity, period. She set down her wine glass, her expression sobering. You asked earlier why I wanted you specifically to teach me. I wasn't entirely honest in my answer. Daniel waited, sensing importance in her tone. The truth is, Avery continued, I need these skills for the meeting. That's real. But I also needed this. Someone to talk to normally. Someone who sees me rather than everything attached to me. Even if it's just for a few hours a week. Even if it's under the pretense of etiquette lessons. Her honesty struck him with unexpected force. Daniel had spent years learning to read people, to understand their needs and motivations. But Avery's admission was rawer than he'd anticipated. I understand loneliness, he said quietly. Different circumstances, but I understand. Do you? I'm 38, unmarried, no close friends in the city. I spend my time perfecting a craft that most people don't notice or appreciate. I go home to an empty apartment and cook meals for one. I know what it's like to be surrounded by people and still feel isolated. Avery met his eyes, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps. Understanding. Then we're both somewhat lost, she said softly. Perhaps. Or perhaps we're both exactly where we need to be. The afternoon light had shifted, streaming through the dining room windows at a lower angle, painting everything in golden tones. Daniel glanced at his watch. Nearly 5:30. 3.5 hours had passed in what felt like minutes. I should go, he said, though he felt oddly reluctant to leave. I have an early shift tomorrow. Of course. Avery stood and the professional mask slipped back into place. A necessary armor, Daniel now understood. Same time next week? That works. Sunday is my slowest day. Sunday, then. She walked him back through the penthouse toward the elevator. At the door, she paused. Daniel? Yes? Thank you. For coming. For agreeing to this. For everything. You're welcome. The elevator arrived. Doors sliding open silently. Daniel stepped inside, then turned to face her. Avery? Yes. You're going to be fine. At the meeting, I mean. You're a fast learner, and you're more capable than you think. Her smile was small but genuine. I hope you're right. The doors closed, and Daniel descended through the building, watching the floor numbers decrease. As he exited into the Tribeca evening, now purple with approaching dusk, he pulled out his phone and sent a quick text to his sister. False alarm, all good. Talk soon. The walk to the subway felt different than the walk toward the penthouse had felt. Then, he'd been walking into unknown danger. Now, he was walking away from an afternoon that had challenged every assumption he'd held about Avery Romano, and perhaps about himself. On the subway home, surrounded by the familiar press of humanity, Daniel thought about loneliness and connection, about the ways people found each other across impossible divides. He thought about a woman who commanded fear, teaching herself vulnerability in 2-hour increments. He thought about himself, a waiter who'd stumbled into something larger than table settings. And he wondered, as Brooklyn approached through the subway windows, what exactly he'd agreed to and where it might lead. 4 weeks transformed everything. The lessons became ritual. Every Sunday at 2 o'clock, Daniel arrived at the Tribeca penthouse with lesson plans carefully outlined in a leather notebook he'd purchased specifically for this purpose. What had begun as simple etiquette instruction evolved into something deeper, more complex, more dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with Avery's reputation. On the 5th Sunday, as November wind rattled the penthouse windows, Daniel arrived to find Avery already seated at the dining table, practicing her posture without prompting. You're early, he observed, setting down his bag. Eager student. She smiled, and Daniel noted how much more frequently she smiled now. The careful mask she wore with everyone else had begun to slip during their sessions, revealing glimpses of the woman beneath the armor. They'd moved beyond basic table settings into more nuanced territory. The subtle art of formal conversation, how to navigate difficult topics with grace, the unspoken rules that governed interactions among the truly powerful. Daniel drew on every experience from his years serving diplomatic dinners, celebrity gatherings, business negotiations conducted over carefully plated courses. "Today, we're focusing on wine service," Daniel announced, noting the bottles that had been laid out. "Not just drinking, understanding. Your business associates will expect you to discuss terroir, vintage, pairing philosophy. This isn't about snobbery. It's about shared language." Avery leaned forward, attentive. "Show me." As Daniel uncorked the first bottle, a Barolo he'd requested specifically, he became aware of how close they were standing. This happened more frequently now, these moments of proximity that felt charged with something neither acknowledged. His hand brushed hers as he demonstrated proper decanting technique, and he felt her sharp intake of breath. "The key," he said, keeping his voice steady and professional, "is patience. You can't rush good wine. It needs to breathe, to open, to reveal itself gradually. Like people," Avery said softly. Their eyes met over the decanter. Daniel saw something in her expression that made his pulse quicken. A vulnerability, an invitation, a question neither was ready to ask aloud. He stepped back, creating necessary distance. "Exactly like people." The lesson continued, but the air between them had shifted. They both felt it. The way conversations lingered longer than necessary. The way silence became comfortable rather than awkward. The way they'd begun to anticipate each other's thoughts and responses. During a break, while Avery studied tasting notes, Daniel moved to the windows. The city sprawled below, Sunday afternoon quiet descending over the financial district. He could see people walking dogs in parks, couples holding hands on street corners, the normal rhythms of lives untouched by the complexity of his current situation. "You're thinking too much," Avery said from behind him. "Occupational hazard?" She joined him at the window, maintaining a careful foot of distance. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel considered deflecting, then remembered their agreement. Complete honesty during sessions. "I'm thinking about how different your world is from mine. How none of this should work. You and I, these lessons, any of it. And yet it does work, which concerns me." "Why does it concern you?" "Because I'm starting to forget why I should be concerned. And that seems dangerous." Avery was quiet for a long moment, her reflection ghostly in the window glass. "I've been thinking about danger too. Different kind, maybe, but related." "What kind?" "The danger of getting used to this. To having someone I can talk to honestly. To Sunday afternoons that feel normal instead of like everything else in my life." She turned to face him directly. "In 2 weeks, I have that business meeting. After that, there's no reason for lessons to continue." "No," Daniel agreed quietly. "There isn't. Unless we wanted them to continue." The statement hung between them, heavy with implication. Daniel knew what she was really asking. Was this just professional instruction, or had it become something more? Before he could answer, Avery's phone buzzed insistently on the dining table. She glanced at it, and her expression changed instantly. The vulnerable woman disappearing, the controlled professional emerging. "I'm sorry," she said, her tone formal now. "I need to take this. Business situation." "Of course." She stepped into the hallway, her voice dropping to urgent tones Daniel couldn't decipher. He used the time to review his notes, to remind himself of boundaries, of the clear line between instructor and student that was becoming increasingly blurred. When Avery returned 15 minutes later, her face was carefully neutral, but Daniel had learned to read the subtle signs: tension around her eyes, the set of her shoulders, the way her hands flexed unconsciously. "Everything all right?" he asked. "It will be." She didn't elaborate, and Daniel didn't press. Their arrangement had clear boundaries. He taught etiquette, she attended lessons. Everything else remained firmly outside their bubble. They worked through the rest of the afternoon, but the earlier intimacy had evaporated, replaced by professional distance. Daniel recognized it as necessary, a reminder that whatever connection was forming between them existed in a fragile space that reality could shatter at any moment. As he prepared to leave, Avery walked him to the elevator as had become customary. "Next week," she said, "I'd like to practice the full formal dinner experience. Multiple courses, proper timing, everything exactly as it would be at the business meeting." "I can arrange that. I'll coordinate with your house manager on the menu." "Thank you." She hesitated, then added, "Daniel, what you said earlier, about forgetting why you should be concerned?" "Yes? I'm forgetting too. I thought you should know." The elevator arrived before Daniel could respond. He stepped inside, and as the doors closed, he saw Avery's expression, conflicted, honest, vulnerable in a way that made his chest tighten. The descent felt longer than usual. Daniel's mind raced, processing implications, recognizing patterns. He was developing feelings for Avery Romano, real feelings that went beyond professional respect or intellectual curiosity. And unless he was completely misreading the situation, she was developing them too. This was a complication neither of them needed. On the subway home, Daniel pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, stopping on his sister's number. He should call her, talk through what was happening, get perspective from someone who knew him well. Instead, he pocketed the phone and stared out the window at the darkness rushing past. The following Sunday, their penultimate session before the business meeting, Daniel arrived to find the penthouse transformed. The dining room had been set for an elaborate multi-course meal, complete with professional kitchen staff borrowed from one of Avery's restaurants. Full dress rehearsal, Avery explained. She wore an elegant black dress and heels, her hair styled formally. She looked stunning, and Daniel had to remind himself to breathe normally. Then I should match the formality. He'd anticipated this and brought a suit, which he changed into in the guest bathroom. When he returned, Avery's eyes widened slightly. You clean up well. Hospitality professional. I know how to dress for the occasion. They took their positions at the table, Avery as the host, Daniel as both instructor and guest. The kitchen staff began service, and for the next 3 hours they enacted the perfect formal dinner. But something had changed. The rehearsal felt less like instruction and more like an actual date. Intimate conversation over wine, shared laughter at small mistakes, the comfortable rhythm of two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. During the cheese course, Avery demonstrated perfect technique with the pecorino knife, the same correction that had started everything. She caught Daniel's eye and smiled. Full circle, she said. You've learned well. I had an excellent teacher. She set down the knife, her expression turning serious. Daniel, I need to tell you something. His heart rate accelerated. All right, this arrangement, these lessons, they've meant more to me than I can easily express. You've given me something I didn't know I was missing. A few hours each week where I can just be myself, where someone expects nothing from me except honesty. That's rare. That's precious. It's been important to me too, Daniel admitted. But it has to end. After the business meeting, it wouldn't be appropriate to continue. Not because I don't want to, but because... She paused, choosing words carefully. Because if we continue, it won't be about etiquette anymore. And I don't think either of us is ready for what it would become. Daniel wanted to argue, to suggest they could maintain boundaries, keep things professional. But he knew she was right. The attraction between them had grown beyond what their careful arrangement could contain. I understand, he said quietly. Do you? Avery's voice held a note of challenge. Because I'm not sure I do. I'm not sure why the first person in years who makes me feel human has to be someone I can't have. Can't or shouldn't. Is there a difference? Daniel considered the question seriously. Yes. Can't suggests impossibility. Shouldn't suggest choice. And which do you think this is? Before he could answer, the house manager appeared, interrupting the moment. Miss Romano, forgive the intrusion. There's a situation requiring your immediate attention. Avery's expression shifted instantly to business mode. What kind of situation? Security matter. Details are sensitive. She stood, apologizing to Daniel. I'm sorry. This will take some time. We should probably end for today. Daniel rose as well, recognizing dismissal when he heard it. But as he gathered his belongings, he noticed Avery's hands trembling slightly. Barely perceptible, but there. Whatever situation had arisen, it had shaken her more than she wanted to show. Avery, he said quietly, if you need anything, I know. Thank you. Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary, communicating things neither could say aloud. Then Daniel left, the elevator carrying him away from the penthouse and back to his ordinary world. That night, alone in his Brooklyn apartment, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about Avery's trembling hands, the concern in the house manager's voice, the sudden shift from intimate dinner to emergency. He told himself it was none of his business, that he'd fulfilled his role as instructor, that whatever complications existed in her life were hers to manage. But he also couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the bubble they'd carefully maintained for 4 weeks was about to burst, and when it did, neither of them would emerge unchanged. His phone buzzed at midnight, a text from Avery's number. Thank you for today, and for the past month. You've given me more than you know. A. Daniel stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. He typed and deleted 3 different responses before finally settling on, same here. Good luck with the meeting. You'll be brilliant. Her response came immediately. One more lesson, next Sunday, last one. I'll be there. As Daniel finally drifted toward sleep, he wondered what that final lesson would bring, and whether they could really walk away from each other when it ended. The final lesson never happened. On Wednesday morning, 3 days before their scheduled session, Daniel's phone rang at 6 a.m. An unknown number, but he answered anyway, heart already racing. Mr. Hayes, this is Robert, Miss Romano's house manager. There's been an incident. Miss Romano is requesting your presence at Lenox Hill Hospital Private Wing. I'm sending a car. 20 minutes later, Daniel arrived at the hospital's discreet VIP entrance. Security personnel checked his identification before escorting him through sterile corridors to a private room where Avery sat upright in bed, her left arm in a sling, a bandage visible above her eyebrow. "You came," she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "Of course I came." Daniel moved to her bedside, careful not to touch her, but unable to hide his concern. "What happened?" "Business meeting went poorly. Some associates were unhappy with certain decisions." She tried to smile, winced. "I'm fine, just bruised pride and a dislocated shoulder." "Avery, I know what you're thinking. This is why we can't continue. This is why someone like you doesn't belong in someone like me's world." Her eyes met his, vulnerable and fierce simultaneously. "And you're right." Daniel pulled a chair close to the bed, sitting carefully. "I wasn't thinking that. No. I was thinking that I've spent 4 weeks getting to know you. The real you, not the reputation. And that person doesn't deserve to be hurt, regardless of what business complications exist." Avery's hand found his, her fingers interlacing with his. "Daniel, I need to tell you something. That business meeting we've been preparing for? It's happening tonight. I'm checking myself out of here in 2 hours to attend. You can't be serious." "I have to be. Weakness is fatal in my world. If I don't show, if I let this setback become visible." She didn't finish, but Daniel understood. "Then let me help." "How?" "The same way I've been helping. We do a final practice session. Here now. We make sure you're ready, that you can walk into that room and command the space despite everything." For the first time since he'd entered, Avery's eyes filled with tears. "Why would you do that?" "Because somewhere in the past month you stopped being a student and became someone I care about." Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "And people who care about each other show up when it matters." They spent the next hour in that hospital room, Daniel coaching Avery through posture that would hide her injury, conversation techniques that would project strength, the small details that would make her appear unshaken. The house manager arrived with her formal attire, and Daniel helped coordinate with the medical staff to ensure she could manage the evening. As the time approached for her to leave, Daniel stood at the window, watching the city wake up below. "After tonight," Avery said from behind him, "I think we need to make a choice." "What kind of choice?" "Whether this ends here, safely, with both of us going back to our separate lives, or whether we acknowledge what's been happening and see where it leads, despite all the complications." Daniel turned to face her. She stood in her formal dress, shoulder expertly concealed, looking every inch the powerful woman who commanded boardrooms and business empires. But he could see past that now, could see the loneliness, the hope, the question in her eyes. "I vote for complicated," he said quietly. Her smile was radiant despite the pain she must have been feeling. "So do I, but with conditions. I'm not joining your world, Avery. I'm a waiter, a hospitality professional. That's who I am. I wouldn't want you any other way. And you'll need to find space for normal in your life. Sunday dinners that aren't business meetings. Conversations that aren't strategic. Moments where you can just be yourself. I can do that. With you." The car arrived to take her to the meeting. At the hospital entrance, Avery turned back to Daniel one final time. "Wish me luck?" "You don't need luck. You have skill, preparation, and courage. That's better than luck." She kissed his cheek quickly, then was gone, sliding into the black car that would carry her toward her business obligations. Daniel took a cab back to Brooklyn, his mind spinning. He'd just committed to something impossible, a relationship between two people from incompatible worlds. It would be difficult, probably painful, certainly complicated. But as he entered his apartment and saw Avery's business card still on his refrigerator, the one she'd left that first night, he realized that sometimes the most important things in life were the complicated ones. The connections that required courage, compromise, and the willingness to choose each other despite every logical reason not to. His phone buzzed hours later. A text from Avery. "Meeting successful. Dinner Sunday? Just us. No etiquette required." Daniel smiled, typing his response. "Perfect. I'll cook." 3 months later, they were still navigating the impossible. Avery maintained her position. Daniel kept his restaurant job. They carved out stolen moments. Quiet dinners in his apartment. Early morning walks before the city woke. Sunday afternoons that belonged only to them. It wasn't easy. Her world occasionally intruded in frightening ways. His normalcy sometimes frustrated her intensity. They argued, compromised, learned each other's boundaries. But on a February evening, as snow fell softly over Manhattan and they sat together in Daniel's small kitchen sharing pasta he'd made from scratch, Avery looked at him with those dark, intelligent eyes and said, "You know what you taught me? Proper fish fork technique?" She laughed. that you can be powerful and vulnerable simultaneously. That strength isn't about armor, it's about choosing authenticity even when it's terrifying. Daniel reached across the table, taking her hand. You taught me something too. What's that? That courage isn't the absence of fear. It's correcting someone's table manners even when you're terrified of the consequences. They both smiled, remembering that night in the restaurant that had changed everything. Outside, New York continued its endless rhythm. Inside, two people from impossible worlds had found something rare and precious, each other. And sometimes, that was enough.